Rock is lit. Confidential. Welcome to an episode dedicated to the magnetic force that was Anita Pallenberg, a woman whose name is etched in the annals of rock and roll history. As we eagerly anticipate the May 3rd, 2024 release of Catching Fire, the story of Anita Pallenberg, a documentary unveiling the enigmatic layers of her life, it's impossible not to be captivated by her presence. Anita was more than just a muse or a fashion icon. She was a powerhouse, a fiery, empowered force that left an indelible mark on the 60s and 70s rock scene. In a world dominated by men, Anita stood out as a symbol of strength, influencing legends like the Rolling Stones with her unparalleled charisma. Directed by women, Svetlana Zill and Alexis, Catching Fire offers a fresh perspective, delving into Anita's journey through the lens of her unpublished memoir. From her relationships with Brian Jones and Keith Richards to her collaborations with iconic filmmakers, Anita's impact reverberates through music, cinema, and fashion. South African director and producer Alexis is best known for her work in documentaries. She has collaborated with the National Geographic and BBC World channels. She won the Producers Guild of America Award for her film We Steal Secrets, the story of WikiLeaks. Her other work includes Speaking with Light, Divide and Conquer, the story of Roger Ailes, and Bright Lights, starring Carrie Fisher and Debbie Reynolds. She's married to actor and director Fisher Stevens, with whom she collaborated on the Carrie Fisher-Debbie Reynolds documentary. Svetlana Zill is an award-winning filmmaker born and raised in Brooklyn, New York. Her feature directorial debut, Catching Fire, the story of Anita Pallenberg, premiered at the 2023 Cannes Film Festival and screened at the Zurich International Film Festival, London BFI Film Festival, and Rome Film Festival, and will be released theatrically by Magnolia Pictures in May 2024. She recently produced In Restless Dreams, the music of Paul Simon, which premiered at the 2023 Toronto International Film Festival and will be released in spring 2024. Previously, she produced films and television for some of the most prolific documentarians of our time, including Alex Gibney, Errol Morris, and Morgan Spurlock. Her work has aired on HBO, Showtime, Netflix, A&E, PBS, and the New York Times, and has explored a wide range of subjects, from vast CIA conspiracies to eccentric sports fans to pop culture icons, fine artists, and composers. Join Catching Fire directors Svetlana Zill and Alexis and me as we dive into the behind-the-scenes stories, previously unseen photos and film footage shot by Anita, Keith Richards, and Mick Jagger, and the untold tales of a woman ahead of her time. Get ready to be transported into the world of Anita Pallenberg, a legend, an icon, and a true rock and roll pioneer. Thanks for joining me, Svetlana and Alexis.
Hi, Christy.
Hi.
Huge congratulations on Catching Fire, which is due out in theaters and on-demand outlets May the 3rd. I got the chance to screen it a week or so ago, and I loved it.
Amazing. Thank you. Christy, where are you from?
North Carolina.
Lovely.
Great.
Can you hear the accent?
I was trying to place it.
Yeah, I get that a lot.
Yeah.
The film is such a candid, unsentimental look at Anita Pallenberg's life, and it includes these amazing, never-before-seen home movies and photos. Were you both interested in Anita before beginning work on the film?
Yeah, I knew of her in a more peripheral sense. I definitely am a big music fan and a bit of a music nerd, I guess, and love just the 60s and 70s in music and culture and fashion. And my background is in archival research. Those were the first jobs that I had working in documentary film. So I also love that kind of historic footage. So the film appealed, I think, on many levels, but the main draw was really the access to Anita's voice and her perspective through the pages of her unpublished memoir. Having that perspective was, I think, the most, that and this incredible footage, the Super 8 footage that we had in the film was a big draw to take on the project.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's talk about this manuscript that you were able to see. So, after Anita died in 2017, her family was clearing out her belongings and came across her previously unseen, unfinished memoir.
Yeah.
So, as I understand it, Anita's son with Keith Richards, Marlon, approached Alexis to make a documentary based on the memoir. Now, Alexis, I know you've done some fabulous work in documentaries, but do you know why he approached you for this project? I mean, had he seen your documentary on Debbie Reynolds and Carrie Fisher called Bright Lights?
He had seen that, but it was through mutual friends that he approached us and I approached me. And I think that's sometimes the best way if you get a personal recommendation. So I think it was a combination of factors, feeling that he could be candid with me and we would, there was sort of an atmosphere of trust because I'd been recommended by people who he liked and who he trusted. And then also knowing that I was capable of making a film. And then it was the same when Svetlana came on board. If he had not liked her, it would have been a very difficult collaboration. But also very soon he established that she was a total music nerd and had worked on like a bunch of great films, and he could feel that he was professionally in good hands.
Besides reading Anita's unfinished memoir and talking to her family and friends, did you do any research for the project? Did you watch other documentaries on the Stones that featured her? I'm thinking of one doc in particular that I just watched called The Stones and Brian Jones. And unlike in your film, Anita comes across as quite cruel in that one. Have you seen it?
No, we hadn't seen that documentary. And as far as I know, that filmmaker never spoke to anyone who was close to her.
Ah,
It's a different point of view, right?
yes, very different point of view. I love that Keith Richards quote about Anita. He said she knew everything and she could say it in 5 languages. So
Yeah.
she was definitely a muse, an inspiration to the Rolling Stones musically and in many other ways too. But a muse to me suggests a passive role, and I see her as more of a leader, this incredible female force to be reckoned with. And Marianne Faithfull says at one point in the documentary that she and Anita were the right women for the Stones at the right time, that she and Anita weren't with them for their power, they had their own power. So, talk more about Anita's role in the Stones.
I think you hit the nail on the head with saying that she was a leader. I mean, I think, and that word muse is such a reductive, it can be such a reductive role to play, and this idea of this passivity, but she was a force to be reckoned with. I mean, she was incredibly intelligent and funny and wild and smart and cultured and had access to, and experiences that they hadn't had before. She had been in New York and was hanging out, in the downtown Warhol Ginsberg scene. She was hanging out with Jasper Johns. She had lived in Paris. She spoke many languages, like from that Keith quote. She just had a very fresh and unique perspective and energy that I think was a huge contribution on top of this incredible taste in music and fashion and art.
She was very worldly, and I think they were pretty English then, and they were musicians, and she'd met loads of different people. But you can be a muse at the same time. I wouldn't say she was not a muse. I just would say she wasn't only a muse.
Yeah, exactly.
A muse can be a firecracker as well as, a more sort of passive inspiration. And she was certainly on the firecracker end of it.
Yeah, and I think the access that we had and the material we had, it's she's not just a muse, she's a three-dimensional human being, right? She's a complicated woman, and we were interested in her complexity.
Yeah, in many ways, she was a member of the Rolling Stones. When she first met Keith, he was very shy. She got him to dress in this much more flamboyant way. I guess the same with Brian Jones. And I guess for people who don't really know her history, she met them in, was it 1965?
Yes.
Okay. And then started out as Brian Jones's girlfriend, and that relationship was very volatile and ended, and she had a long-term relationship with Keith Richards, and they had 3 children. So her role in the Rolling Stones was really pivotal in getting them from the stage where they were before to something much more sophisticated, artistic. I mean, her role was huge in that respect.
Yes, I think so. I mean, it sounds so highfalutin now, right? From our perspective. But if you imagine like a group of young kids today who are very creative, say, like a group of young kids from North Carolina, and they're in a great band, but they're from North Carolina, and in comes an Italian girl who's lived in Paris and New York, and she brings with her all the kind of connections and knowledge and fun and inspiration from those places. It would be the same, right? Everyone would be like, wow, let's hang. It's sort of like break things open a little bit.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, they didn't have cell phones back in those days, so they didn't really have access to the world in the same way, right?
Yeah.
Also, she was very much living in the moment, and they all were living in the moment. I think we look back, especially on the 60s, as like having this, there's so much mythology and so much and I'm part of it, like being obsessed about that history. But I think these are also just young people living their lives, not thinking about the fact that this is a historic moment in culture.
Yeah.
It's like they're having fun and living day to day and doing drugs and listening to music and making music and traveling the world and just being free. It didn't have the same weight that I think maybe we put on it in retrospect.
Right. Scarlett Johansson provides the voice of Anita in the film. Svetlana, is it true that you went to elementary school with Scarlett in New York City?
Wow, you really did your research. Yes. We went to PS41. We went to school in the Village together, but that was not the connection that drove Scarlett to working on this film, I should say. That was just a happy coincidence.
Did that have more to do with the fact that Scarlett had worked with Fisher Stevens, who, Alexis, that's your husband? They'd worked together recently on a project. So it seems like there's connection coming in both directions here.
What did they work together on? Oh, on Asteroid City. Yeah. Right. It's fast to think.
What was the name of it again? Oh, Asteroid City. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, but there were like 100 people working on Asteroid City.
But that's those films. Yeah.
Yeah. It's the most, it's got it. Wes Anderson's films have got amazing casts, I will say.
And they kind of like descend on a small city and all live together and eat together. And I think it's a very fun atmosphere. So they had just seen each other, I think.
They had just seen each other. Honestly, there's a few different connections. We have a great friend called Zara Duffy, who used to work with Fisher, who now works with Scarlett. And Zara was very helpful. Zara works for her development company. Scarlett is a director too. So she directed her first film now, New York, they just wrapped. So, we have like a number of connections to her, but none of them was so strong that she was in any way obliged to make the film. I feel like it helped get the request across, so that her agents would read it.
Right.
And that make her aware of it, which is immensely helpful. But it's entirely due to her generosity that she did it. And that will be one of life's great mysteries, because it certainly wasn't for the money.
No one goes to documentary for the money.
Well, my question with regard to her really has to do with this. Anita was German-Italian and Scarlett's American. So why go with an American to voice Anita instead of someone with an accent that's more similar to hers?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's one that we thought a lot about in the course of making the film. And we did actually try different accents. We read the voice of Anita with a few different actors, one who was more British, one who did a more German version, an Italian version. And it felt like we were chasing an accent that was, in Anita's case, a very distinct sort of pan-European, ever-changing accent, depending on where she lived, depending on, it was, her voice really evolved over time. And I think it was this elusive sort of part of that we were trying to capture an accent versus necessarily thinking about the soul and the voice of Anita that is going to be believable on screen in this incredible footage that we have from the 60s and 70s of her. And I think once we realized, we reoriented our focus on trying to think of someone whose voice was really more in line with the kind of, DNA, both in sexiness, but also in just like an intellectual capacity and a knowingness and an allure. It felt like, it sort of broke open the possibilities for us. And Scarlett was really one of the very first people that we thought of in a sort of more pie in the sky, like if we could get anyone to do it, maybe we should try it with Scarlett. And it just happened to work out, which we were really lucky.
I think it's a great fit, by the way.
Yeah, it is a polarizing choice, of course.
There are people who wish it was more European, but you cannot imitate her voice.
Yeah.
So in the absence of a credible imitation, what do you do?
Yeah.
That's the question.
No, I think it's a great fit for all the reasons that you just said. There's a lot of tragedy, addiction, trauma that goes on in the film, and one of the most heart-wrenching parts involves the death of Anita and Keith's 10-week-old son, Tara. This understandably knocked both Anita and Keith off their pins. My take on that tragedy, as it's presented in the documentary, is that it was basically the beginning of the end of their relationship.
I think
it was certainly a low point.
Yeah.
But there were quite a few low points. We don't include them all in the film. There was so much going on. The big bust in Canada was another low point where they had to go for the black box treatment. Remember the drug addiction? They did the wackiest things to try and get people, off drugs back then, where they put wires in your ears in a little black box doing frequency sort of reconfigurations, and this enormous bust and a lot of stress and strain around that. It was certainly a low point, but it's hard to say.
I think, yeah.
It was a tragedy.
Yeah.
It was a tragedy. A shared tragedy brings you closer together in some awful way. I don't know. It's hard to know. We didn't talk to Keith about that.
Yeah.
And Anita's not around to talk about that, but
ultimately only they really know.
Yeah. Ultimately they know, and we'd hesitate to say that was the beginning of the end.
Okay. All right. Now, you mentioned talking to Keith, and he is featured in the movie. You interviewed him at Electric Lady Studios, I believe. Tell me about that. How forthcoming was he? Was he reluctant to get involved at all?
He did not jump at the opportunity to be interviewed for the film. It took quite a while for him to agree to sit down for the interview. So we really went off making the film for basically 2 years working on the film. So it was very much towards the end of us working on the project that he did agree to sit down and talk to us. And then, once he did, it was a really lovely, very open, honest conversation. He sat down and he was very ready to sort of go there and jumped right in and really spoke at length for quite a while before we even asked a question. And it was very generous and very vulnerable in a way, I think, for him to speak to us about Anita, who's obviously very important in his life, but it's his personal life and it's not necessarily the kind of interview he does very often. Yeah, we were really grateful that it worked out in the end, that we got to sit together and speak with him.
It seems like he still has great affection for her. And as I think it was Marlon who says in the film at one point that Keith had told him, I always loved your mother, I just couldn't live with her.
Yeah. They had great tenderness towards each other and respect, and they had a relationship, in later life. They had grandchildren together. They'd have family occasions together, Christmases and weddings and christenings, and she visited his house in England when he was in England.
They were great friends, and there was a palpable love there, I think, even just that we felt in talking to Keith, and then that also comes through in Anita's writing as well.
And I have to say that Patty was really good about that too, Keith's second wife.
Yes.
She's very family-minded and was very accepting of Anita, even though Anita, I'm sure, was quite a handful at times, not the easiest ex-wife to deal with.
Well, you mentioned something a few minutes ago about not being able to put everything in the film, and obviously you couldn't do that. But I do have a question about something that isn't in the film. She had a well-known interest in the occult, and she was very friendly with the avant-garde filmmaker and occultist Kenneth Anger, and that wasn't mentioned in the documentary. I'm wondering if it was in her manuscript.
It was in the manuscript, and it wasn't particularly significant.
Yeah.
And she actually writes about Kenneth Anger being a bit annoying and sort of being around too much. And Marianne Faithfull told me, like, oh, yes, she was into the occult. Yes, we all were, but we would have been happy. She named sort of some kind of like vampire novelist. And she was like, well, we would have read those too. I don't think it certainly wasn't a life-lasting fascination. It was at a period of her life when she was young and pretty high. And I think it was considered
it was sort of like
anti-bourgeois and quite risque. But it wasn't she wasn't like doing tarot readings later in life or sort of playing the Ouija board.
Yeah, I think that is part of more of the mythology around her than it is true to who she, than what her interests really were.
Okay.
They had Kenneth Anger around, and it's funny to read about him. He did a ceremony for Marlon when he was born and kind of like put blood on the door or whatever it was. And, but it was sort of, done like in a kind of wild and crazy way, as opposed to like, this is what we believe. And then not very soon afterwards, she's kind of saying, oh, bloody Kenneth is always waking us up by, lurching around the lawn in all hours of the night and the morning, yelling his head off. It wasn't like a great reverence there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I get the feeling he wore out his welcome with a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised. Yeah.
I was struck by the fact that in the film, Marlon refers to his parents by their names rather than mom or dad for the most part. Yeah. And to me, that sort of suggests a kind of a distance. Did you get a sense of what his relationship is like now with Keith and what it became with Anita in her later years?
Yeah.
It's so interesting. You're the only person to have noticed that or have said it. It is notable. And when I see that with other people, I notice it. But they're not distant. I think it's almost a product of him being a grown-up before his time.
Exactly.
He wouldn't have a long and luscious childhood.
Yeah.
He was forced to grow up quite quickly. And he sort of talks about them in grown-up terms, but he's very close to them.
Yes, there's a lot of love there.
There's a lot of love and a lot of...
And it's interchangeable. It's not always Keith and Anita. He also says my dad. I mean, when you talk
to my dad, yeah.
So I do think, I know I grew up with someone who refers to his parents by name and always did. And he, didn't live exactly a very similar life, but was a tiny adult from a very young age, was very self-sufficient, kind of living on his own in New York when he was like 10 that time. So I do think it is a product of growing up fast.
Well, I think that's very clear in the film that he had to grow up fast. I think there's a reference to him being like the man of the house in some respects.
Right.
And being conditioned to, if there's a possibility that the cops are going to come, hide the paraphernalia. There's the whole bit, and we don't have time to get into it, but the whole bit of the tragedy that occurred later on when Anita and Marlon were living in New York State, and there's a young man that she has a relationship with who dies, and Marlon is running around just cleaning the scene. So obviously he and his sister Angela had somewhat of a traumatic childhood. I think I've heard you say at some point or read someplace that neither one of them drives cars because they were in so many accidents when they were growing up.
Their parents were terrible drivers. They were on their box on drugs, and they were terrible drivers.
Yeah. Marlon in particular has memorable experiences of being in car accidents that I think
just keep going off into the ditch, cutting off or going off or being too tired or going too fast. Also speedboats. Keith crashed a boat into the jetty in France. Anita was always terrified when Marlon would go off in a speedboat with him. I think they just had a lot of misadventures, I think, adventure and misadventure. And whether it was their house in England burnt down, was a beautiful thatch roofed house and burnt to cinders. There's a great photo in one of the English newspapers. It's like, I think the family standing on the lawn looking at the burnt house. There was a lot of accidents.
Yeah. For what it's worth, I don't drive either, but that's because I'm a native New Yorker.
Not the weirdest thing. world, to be honest.
No. And there are a lot of people who wish I wouldn't drive. So there you go.
You can be part of their gang.
Yeah, we're part of the drive me around gang. She loves it. Alexis loves it.
I think I would like to be in that gang. That sounds nice. Before you leave, what do you hope viewers will take away from Anita's story? And what impact do you think her legacy will have on future generations?
I think embracing complexity and nuance and the messiness of life, and that she is this powerhouse of a woman. We fell in love with her story and wanted to share it with everyone. But I think in that comes an embracing of how complicated people are and that they can be many things at once.
Also, that there's kind of like a bit of a people's history. You think you know the history of the Rolling Stones because it's been told by from 30,000 feet, and then when you get it from another perspective, it seems totally different, so
yeah.
These big famous stories and everything. And then there's always kind of a much more, interesting, relatable, everyday experience.
Right. There's the mythology and then there's the human lived experience.
And we're all in this kind of together. There's people have said to us, I really relate to Marlon. My parents were really tricky. We had somebody who interviewed us who said that, I really relate to him. Or there's people that say, gosh, my mum was an actor too. And then, at the time she stopped working. And, there's all sorts in there that is quite ordinary. Of course, she was an extraordinary person, but nobody transcends humanity.
Well, I've been fascinated with Anita ever since I was a kid and saw this iconic photo of her with Brian Jones where they're back to back and he's tickling her hands and she starts laughing. She's always been one of these figures in rock history that I think made the whole thing tick.
Yay.
Mm-hmm. So thank you for making the film. I loved it. I watched it 3 times. I will watch it again. When it comes out, I will go to the theater and see it. And I can't tell enough people how fantastic it is to have this incredible documentary about this kick-ass woman made by kick-ass women. I love it.
Thank you so much, Christy. We really love talking to you.
Best of luck with the film. And thank you so much for talking with me.
All right. Ciao.
Ciao. Rock is lit, confidential.